since 1988 towards freedom and democracy in Tibet. We are basically a organization of Tibetans and Westerners. I happen to be a Westerner today, but I would like to relay also, I think, the appreciation of my Tibetan colleagues for your solidarity of our Chinese, Taiwanese, Uyghur, and Mongolian friends, and of course from Hong Kong as well. So this is really important. I think it stresses also one very significant factor here, and that's the one of interdependence. So what has been happening in Tibet has shown elsewhere. What has been happening in southern Mongolia has shown elsewhere. What is now happening in Hong Kong has shown elsewhere. So it is really crucial for a wholesome perspective on the CCP policies to not just focus on one issue, but to understand the whole package. And I think that is one lesson learned that needs to be learned from my perspective from the past, because if we look at Tibet, I mean, you all recall the 2008 pre-Olympic protests that happened countrywide in Tibet that were clamped down, followed by a row of self-immolations of around about more than 150 Tibetans. And what was the reaction of the international community? There were indeed a number of parliamentarians, governments, and also the UN, then High Commissioner, speaking out on the self-immolations, but no concrete action was followed up on it by government. So I think that was a grave mistake, because it allowed the Chinese government to test the waters. I mean, it was sort of, if you will, not just an attempt to what they call pacify Tibet and the resistance there, but also to test out new strategies, because I think they understood that by 2008, the strategies they had applied to Tibet at the time were not working. So they had to come up with something new. And that was Chen Guangguo, amongst others, but predominantly him, the TAR, so-called Tibet Autonomous Region Party Secretary, who later, after 2016, moved on to East Turkestan. So what did he do? He applied a number of repressive measures, for example, like installing convenient police stations every 100, 150 meters from each other in distance in urban centers. He tried out technological surveillance for the first time, and so forth. And he developed really a proactive approach to repression, which we then saw in East Turkestan, because it was no longer sufficient for them apparently to react to acts of protest and dissidence, but they then went proactively to the individual Tibetan household. It virtually was the case. They sent party cadres to the countryside in Tibet to knock on doors, to look what is the portrait of the four great leaders, what hanging up on a wall, and not the Dalai Lama or somebody else. So this, and I must know, Chen Guangguo never got on the sanctuary list. He never got there. I mean, he's now out in Xinjiang as well. He's Turkestan, but he never got on that list. So, and what he did in East Turkestan was to further develop the technological surveillance. And it comes back now, we've heard about the DNA collection, a massive DNA collection going on Tibet now, as reported by Human Rights Watch and Canadian Citizen Lab, and so forth. Jumping to the next interdependence, relocation of nomads and Tibetans. Talk to our southern Mongolian friends, what has happened in Mongolia. And it is so reminiscent of what has been going on in Tibet these days or over the past 20 years. So that means enforced settlement of nomads, destruction of an autonomous, self-determined lifestyle without alternative, and bringing them into a a market economy structure. Third, Dalai Lama succession, appointment of clergy. Look at the Catholic Church. It's the same game you played. The underground churches, unfortunately, the Vatican has agreed to make a somewhat deal with the CCP, which doesn't work out for the Catholics, as far as we know. We are very concerned that if the next Dalai Lama is being picked by the CCP against the rights of the religious rights of Tibet, that this will cause conflict in Tibet. We ask for governments to raise the stakes with the CCP in order to prevent conflict as a measure of conflict prevention. Fourth, Taiwan and Tibet, the status issue. Why is it that whenever the German government talks about the Dalai Lama, they have to, as a reflex, state that they consider Tibet as a part of China, as they have done in 2020 to a totally unrelated question on a dialogue. Why is that so? This should make you think, everybody who works on Taiwan. You have to be mindful. All of this, as we have monitored over the past years, was happened vis-a-vis a strange sort of, I would say, delusionary, self-delusionary foreign policy here in Germany and perhaps beyond. One of which is compartmentalization. So the attempt to take one issue, human rights, to have it deal with one policy structure, with one ministry. Trade, another ministry. Strategic interests, another ministry. Health, another ministry. So this has led effectively to a sanitization of issues that were unpleasant to talk about, where they feared it may hamper progress in other areas. And climate change, I mean, look at Pelosi and her Taiwan visit. What did they announce? We want to halt the climate talks with the US. So it's also becoming a subject of trade-offs, right? And that's not right. Contrary, what we would like to see is a perception, first, and understanding of the interdependence of all those developments, including in Tibet, which has gotten less attention over the past years, and unjustly so, I would say, given just what I've talked about, that all of this is part of an understanding of national security, of European security. I think the US is much further in their thinking of China. They are seeing the consequence. They are understanding the consequence of what is happening inside the PRC with regard to their position of China and how China acts on them. So this needs to be really changing. And yes, the stakes must be raised. We are calling for sanctions as well, calling for sanctions for those CCP officials who are responsible and accountable for the implementation of policies in Tibet. And we want language. We want clear position from the German government on the succession of the Dalai Lama. It has been half-baked, and it must be understood that the German government has a responsibility to contribute to conflict prevention on Tibet. It's not enough. If it happens, the Chinese bulldozer through the religious rights of the Tibetans and announce the Dalai Lama without much ado, it will have dire consequences. So the stakes must be raised. And one last thing, we're always asking for governments to do things for the Tibetans. It should be in their self-interest. That being said, but Tibetans have something to offer. They are partners in values. Let's understand that. The Tibetan government in exile tries hard to establish a democratic structure in exile, in Dharamsala in India. And the same, the civil society commitment from the Uyghurs, from the Hong Kongers, from the Taiwanese, it must be acknowledged as partners in values, as Wertepartner. For us here in Europe, in an increasingly autocratic world. We need to really change this perception on these stakeholders in the world. And I'd like to close with that.
In other words, Tibet as part of the solution for Europe, for America, in dealing with China and dealing with autocracy, which is, of course, the argument that people make in Taiwan as well, that how much they have to offer experience of China, really granular, close knowledge of that system, of the culture of people, and inside knowledge. And we are not making enough use of it, as you said. How do you concretely, how could we do more? How can the German government do more?
Well, they should support initiatives on a UN level where something is at stake. They must invest political capital. And political capital is cannot be reduced to statements. Statements are necessary. I'm not saying they are unimportant. They are important, but we are beyond the stage of statements. We are definitely. And the EU has taken the right step to issue sanctions on those 4 individuals and 1 institution, I believe, in Xinjiang, in East Turkestan. That was a right step. But it was also a very modest step, I would say. And now with regard to, I mean, just if we talk about the report by Ms. Bachelet, I would say it is also in the interest of all of us that there are consequences being taken first at the Human Rights Council, at the United Nations, that institutionalize a monitoring of CCP policies towards the Uyghurs, but also towards the Tibetans, the Hong Kongers, and the Chinese human rights defenders. Let's not forget about that. So much the German government can stick their head out.
Thank you. I know I'm running over time, and I apologize. It's been such a fascinating panel, so please bear with me. I do have one final small question for you. It's a big topic, but maybe you have a few words to say. We've seen the issues on the border with India. Now, the Mao's five-finger policy pushing south from the Tibetan plateau. Why do you think this is happening? What have you had thoughts about this? Is there any discussion about this among Tibetan thinkers, thought leaders, political leaders?
I would say that's really a tough issue because, I mean, the Tibetans in India have a distinct interest in this situation. And I think what Tibetans are talking about in this context is not so much the concrete developments. I mean, this is of interest as well, but about the solution to this aggressive foreign policy. And I mean, if one goes back to the 80s, we may come across the Dalai Lama's 5-point peace statement, the proposal from Strasbourg at the time where he said, okay, let's demilitarize Tibet, right? So that there's a zone of peace. He called it ahimsa, in India, a zone of peace, right? So I think there's also a geostrategic component to what is going on in Tibet. If Tibet were truly pacified in terms of the respect of the rights of the people, I'm very certain this would also reflect on how, the situation at the borders are, how the Chinese foreign policy would express itself towards India, Bhutan, Nepal, one of those neighboring countries. So I think there's a larger picture to be considered.